Get ready to learn the legal side of podcasting. Stay in the right side of the law. Episode 9, Defamation, Slander, and Libel. And this is Radio Skills for Podcasters.
Learn the secrets of the radio industry.
Create powerful podcasts.
Powerful podcasts.
Hi, this is Kevin Field, host of Radio Skills for Podcasters. In Series 1, we look at the basics you need to know to get the bit between the ears right. In this episode, we look at defamation, libel, and slander. In my view, all journalists, program makers, producers, presenters need to have a strong understanding of the law pertaining to their work. That includes copyright, privacy, defamation, libel, slander, and contempt of court. Podcast has so much freedom. It's fantastic. I love it because of that freedom. Anyone can become a podcaster and create content for others to hear. Citizen journalism is available to the masses. Audio is definitely the new digital, and digital is easy to do. But whilst there is great freedom, of course, this comes with perhaps great responsibility. My intention with this podcast, Radio Skills for Podcasters, is never to stifle your freedom. The idea is to share some ideas with you and some skills and knowledge from the radio industry to help you do what you want to do, to empower you with useful information. I thought perhaps it might be a good idea to share some knowledge around defamation, the legal side of broadcasting, especially libel and slander. At the start of this, I think I should say that the content of this podcast should not be relied on to make any assessment or judgment as to whether content is potentially defamatory or libelous. That's your job as a podcaster. This podcast will outline what the law says in the UK. And of course, other territories have their own laws. They are different. The principles of the law, though, perhaps would be helpful to you and all podcasters to understand. My top tip in this episode is show and tell and how it can help you call and action in your podcast. I always like to know if this podcast helps you out. Please do provide some feedback, get in touch, tell me what you think. If you've got any questions, I will get back to you. The hints and tips, do they help? Do you want something else from the podcast? Is there something that I'm missing? Love to hear from you. It's really easy to get in touch. skills@radioskillsforpodcasters.com or on Twitter @radio_skills. Radio Skills for Podcasters on the Facebook page, which we're slowly building, and the website is being built bit by bit as we go along.
This is Radio Skills for Podcasters.
So libel, slander, defamation. Sounds like a big billing for it. It's a huge billing. In the UK, Scotland and Northern Ireland, we have slightly different layout of the laws of defamation. And again, in the US, it's different again, and other territories all over the world. What is defamation? Libel is defamation in permanent form. Slander is defamation in non-permanent form. What does that mean? Libel tends to be written, broadcast or published online, where slander tends to be the spoken word. Libel is written in emails, tweets, letters, on website forums, in bulletin boards, and so on. Slander can be said down the pub, or at a conference, or in a room full of people. Legal terminology around defamation says this: English law of defamation allows individuals, companies, or firms, which are claimants, to sue for damage to their reputation caused by material that is published and which makes defamatory comments about them. Something is defamatory if it lowers them in the estimation of right-thinking members of the public and or causes them to be shunned or avoided and or disparages them in their office, trade or profession and or exposes them to hatred, ridicule and contempt. What does that mean, though? Well, it's defamatory when you harm someone's good name and reputation. So the characteristics of defamatory issues perhaps come to the fore when you cause someone to be shunned or avoided, or if you cause a lower estimation of the view of them by the general public. You're in trouble if you cause loss of earnings, of course, for their trade, profession or office. And it's not good if you expose someone to contempt or hatred with fellow like-minded people. In England, there are 4 key areas that are considered. The truth. Are the comments true? Can you prove what you have said is actually true to the fact? Do you have proof? Honest opinion, a generally held view and based on fact. Whatever you say about someone can it be backed up factually? Accuse someone of being an alcoholic. Are they factually an alcoholic? Public interest. It is something that the public really need to know. An issue that without revealing would be wrong not to make people aware. They have a right to know. In Scotland, the law is slightly different. Instead of honest opinion, they have fair comment, and there is no public interest rule whatsoever. You can't defame someone if they're dead. You can say what you like about them. It's easy sometimes to come up with a funny line about someone or something in the news, or even repeat a claim that you've heard on the grapevine or seen in a tweet. In all of these, there is one thing you need to ask. Do you know what you're saying is true? Never rebroadcast something simply from seeing it on Twitter. Really don't. There are so many libel cases on Twitter where people have retweeted information about an individual and then they've been sued. I tend not to read things out of newspapers directly to air without doing a bit of research, finding out if it's true. Equally, I don't do this from websites either. I check the facts. There's a brilliant book you should check out called Twibble by Paul Chandler. It's available on Amazon. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's a great book. Paul is an expert in defamation, privacy and contempt of court when it comes to broadcast. Many years ago, when I worked for Capital Radio Group, a well-known global superstar was on the front page of every newspaper in the UK. The group programme director reminded everyone of the rules and said if anyone mentioned that star's name during that morning's breakfast show, they would be not returning the next day. And I remember as a breakfast producer of the show on Fox FM in Oxfordshire, as a radio station, we couldn't do it. Newspapers had lawyers all over the details of the accusation, and also perhaps they could say it was in the public interest and they could defend that. That's the defence they may have put up. But also, equally, their lawyers would have worked out how much damages it would have cost and how much money they would have been bringing in from the sales of the newspapers. But as a radio station, it was difficult. And as a podcaster, well, you couldn't repeat things like that. So always steer clear of repeating something you do not know to be true or that's second-hand hearsay. Fair game, by the way. Fair game is about personal comment. You can make comments that are your opinion formed of a personal viewpoint. These do not hold any threat or malice to the person or business involved. A good example of fair game is this. I don't like Joe Bloggs, the comedian. He just doesn't make me laugh. You can say that about a company as well. That's a personal opinion formed of a personal viewpoint. It's an honest comment and expressed without malice. However, if you said something like, Joe Bloggs calls himself a comedian. His jokes are rubbish. I interviewed him once and he was drunk. He's definitely an alcoholic. You need to be able to prove that he's actually an alcoholic. You should also remember that, as well as your podcast, your blog, your show notes, social media platforms, they're not exempt from defamation. What happens if you libel someone? Well, it's not a criminal offence, it's a civil offence, and it's all about the money. How much have you damaged the person standing in the community? What is the damage worth to them? Damages are worked out from the potential and real harm you've caused. Most settle before court with an apology and a financial settlement of some sort, although some do end up in court. And from what I've researched, it's an expensive game. Comedy is always an interesting area where people think they can caricature or use fair game, but not if it leads to damage to the person's reputation. The rules still apply. And the rules, of course, apply to tweeting and retweeting. If you retweet a message without reading it or understanding it, you could be as guilty as the person who originally tweeted the message. To protect oneself, it's fairly easy. Don't make anything up, check your sources, check again, and if in doubt, leave it out. I think that's great advice for any podcaster.
Learn the secrets of the radio industry.
Radio skills for podcasters.
Today's top tip. What is it that great podcasters do? Well, they show their listener. They enable them to discover the magic themselves. In this podcast, I share lots of information with you. And what I tried to do is share a story along the way that illustrates what I'm trying to tell you. And that's what I mean about show and not just tell. Yes, you can tell people the information. How about showing them that information and how it's worked? The aim is to reveal more than just telling. So share a story that has the purpose of that instruction in it, and you can get lots across. And you can use this for your sponsor credits or your call to action. There's a really interesting, there's a podcast I was listening to the other day where it's sponsored by a coffee company. So he talks about that coffee. And his wife, who doesn't normally drink coffee, is now drinking the coffee that they're promoting on the podcast because they've been given some free samples to test it, to really talk about it. And now he's saying she can't leave that coffee alone. It's the best coffee she's ever tasted, and so on. So he's created a story with it. So what they've done is, instead of just saying, this show is sponsored by Bob's Coffee, they said this show is sponsored by Bob's Coffee. Now look, Bob's Coffee you might just think is like any other coffee, but this coffee is amazing. How do I know that? Because my wife is now drinking that coffee. Let me tell you something about my wife. She's very fussy about coffee. She doesn't drink much. This, she can't leave alone. That sort of thing really adds to the story of what you're trying to sell. Remember, call to actions are sales pitches. So think about how you put them together and show, don't just tell. As ever, I'd love to hear from you. Get in touch if you'd like some one-to-one coaching, or if you'd just like to chinwag. I don't mind. It's easy. skills@radioskillsforpodcasters.com, radio@_skills on Twitter, and Radio Skills for Podcasters on Facebook, and the website itself as well. And also we have the new podcast added to the family. It's on the Radio Skills podcast channel, and it's called Radio Skills for Podcasters, The Edge. So I talk about some of the events I've been to a few conferences lately. Also talk about the feedback from you as the listener of this podcast. I also share some of these stories around the podcast world and media world. So there we go. All right. Join me for that if you can. Next time on Radio Skills for Podcasters, we go into the presentation skills basics. This is the voice and how to work it up and use it. The words you use in your podcast are the keywords that you should focus on that bring audience and listener in again and again. Above the line and below the line characteristics of you as a presenter, the imprint list on your show, and how to be always you while still performing on the podcast. Until then, thanks for listening.
Find us on Facebook, Google+, Radio Skills for Podcasters,
@radio_skills on Twitter.
Thanks for listening.
www.radioskillsforpodcasters.com.